Welcome, everybody, to the most recent episode of the Project Liberal podcast. Today, I am joined by Cathy Reisenwitz. I hope I said your last name correctly, Cathy.
That's right.
That's right. So Cathy is one of the members of the vice chair of the steering committee of the Center for New Liberals. And I know you've had a lot of major publications cover your work, your research, and your advocacy throughout the years. So yeah, she's going to be joining us to talk a bit about today about YIMBYism, its relations to homelessness, and how we can solve the housing crisis and fix problems with real life policy. So that's Cathy. John is my co-host, who's always here. He's the co-founder of Project Liberal. I'm sure he's no new face to many of the people in the audience. But yeah, we just wanted to kick it off, Cathy, by giving the floor to you to maybe talk a little bit about your background, what made you passionate about this issue, and kind of what brought you to where you're at now.
Oh man, yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. My background, grew up conservative, Christian, Southern Baptist in Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama, and got into libertarianism in college and then got into kind of the neoliberal thing a few years ago. I think it was a real mask off moment with the Trump presidency for libertarianism. I think you really kind of saw a lot of people go one of two ways toward more like center left liberal democracy, liberalism as it's been understood throughout the decades and centuries and throughout the world, versus a more reactionary authoritarian kind of viewpoint of quote unquote liberty. And so I've been really blessed to get connected with the Center for New Liberalism. I started my chapter of the Huntsville New Liberals in June. And as far as housing, I got started on that when I moved to San Francisco. And housing is one of those things that intersects with pretty much everything in life that's important. And especially things that I had been super interested in for a long time. So property rights. I have a tattoo that says I own me. I've been interested in property rights and self-ownership for a long time. Even feminism, right? Where you live is often dictated by your finances, and especially as women tend to earn less than men, a lot of times women will stay in relationships they don't necessarily want to stay in because of housing. Impacts racial justice, economic justice, like all of these things, economic growth. So obviously San Francisco is kind of ground zero for the housing crisis in the US, but it's not a thing that's contained to San Francisco anymore by a long shot. We have a housing crisis in Huntsville, Alabama as well. And I think we're probably 20 to 30 years behind San Francisco, but we're heading in the same direction. We're making the same mistakes right now. And so I really want to try to head those mistakes off at the pass as much as possible and prevent these problems from becoming as entrenched as they are in San Francisco.
Yeah, makes sense. I've been to San Francisco many times as well, and they have a real desperate issue. But it's funny to me. It's not funny. It's actually kind of sad. At least of the members of Millennial and Gen Z coming up right now, like many people in Gen Z coming out of college for the first time, there is a true cost of living and a housing crisis that's not necessarily geographic to one city or the other. Don't get me wrong, San Francisco is pretty bad, but those same pricing challenges, the fact that it's almost unattainable for young people to buy a home, that is a national issue. And that's one of the reasons why I was really glad you're able to come and talk to us, because I think people in this kind of the center left liberal movement are really the only people that are articulating a coherent policy solution and really path out of this crisis. And it's one of the solutions that I don't think a lot of young people think are the obvious solution. And I think there's a lot of compelling stuff to be learned there. John, I feel like you were going to chime in with something there.
Yeah, I was curious. You said you kind of gotten into the libertarian movement that kind of morphed into the neoliberal. Do you feel like that's more because you've changed or because the movement itself has changed?
I mean, obviously it's both, but I honestly think that I changed and then the movement changed, where I kind of grew up like, I don't know, like default conservative white girl. And I was really interested in why is libertarianism such a hard sell to people who aren't like well-educated, able-bodied white people, straight white people for the most part. And so I started to look into, I'm a marketer. I want to understand my target audience. So I started to like follow Black women on Twitter. And like I'd always been a feminist, but read more into feminism. And so I didn't really mean to become woke, but just as a result of like getting exposed to ideas and realities beyond my direct experience, I started to become, for lack of a better word, I became aware of systemic oppression in a way I hadn't been before.
For sure.
So I changed, but that was in 2013, really, or like 2011 to 2013 when I underwent the majority of that change. And that's when I started to speak up about what libertarianism has to offer in terms of like anti-racism, feminism, for example. So for example, quote unquote neoliberal housing policy, deregulation of housing, of land use, for example, is anti-racist policy because exclusionary zoning is racist in background, intent, implementation, execution.
Yep.
And so I was just like, okay, like we have a small government, pro-economic growth, anti-racist solution in this. We should be selling it as that. But when I would try to say that, like, hey, here's some libertarian anti-racist policy, libertarians would lose their minds. Like they were so upset that I would identify as an anti-racist, that I would identify as a feminist, that I would be talking about racism, that I would be talking about sexism, homophobia, misogyny, any of that stuff. And so that was my first inkling that like something was amiss. I wouldn't say my first inkling, but that was when I started to like talk about it. Like, hey, something is rotten here.
Yep.
This is something we need to pay attention to as a movement. It's not just that libertarianism has been ignoring racism and sexism, like elements of libertarianism is perpetrating these things. And then, like I said, I feel like with the Trump election, it was just a real mask off moment where all these people who were, movement libertarians who worked for the think tanks and the advocacy orgs in 2013 were just like, oh, you're hysterical, you're making stuff up, you're exaggerating. And then it's like, no, I wasn't. You weren't motivated to listen. And, here we are.
And 2020, I think, only made it worse. I don't know about you, Cathy, but for me, I'd kind of really started coming up involved in the movement from like 2014 to 2016. And I saw a lot of the writing on the wall with the MAGA movement. I feel like, I don't know if this is accurate, but I feel like it partially tore the libertarian movement in half in a way. It was the people that were really on the side of liberalism, in my opinion, versus the people that were illiberal inherently. And I saw that rift forming. And then 2020 blew it out of proportion. I mean, we had a president try to overturn the election. We had the George Floyd protests, which I think were an organic uprising of people with, passionate about the same ideas libertarians could be. And I had a similar experience that you did. It was kind of shocking to me to see that play out.
Watching the Black Lives Matter movement, and where you had 99% of these protests were peaceful, and yet so many libertarians point to that small percentage, just like they're acting just like conservatives, and say, "Oh, we can't support this." But then they turn around. and they go, "Oh, well, these Canadian truckers are shutting down the roads. Good for them. That's great. They're causing billions of dollars of damage to the economy, but that's okay because we support them." But if they cause damage, if a small percentage of people in the Black Lives Matter cause damage, oh, well, that's terrible. We can't have anything to do with that. Can be seen to be associated with that. So there's been such a hypocritical thinking inside libertarianism for a long time now, and I don't know if it's anything new, but it's certainly something that has been surfacing over the past decade and a half, for sure.
Well, one of the things I was going to ask you about, Cathy, to try to tie it all back to the topic that we were going to discuss with YIMBYism, was what you touched on a second ago in your opening remarks. Could you maybe give us a little bit of context on like zoning and how building restrictions tie back to like discrimination and racism? Because I know there's a history there. I'm curious if you could unpack a little bit of that for our audience.
Ooh, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I'll do my best. I could not recommend more highly The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It's a great book. And I had an episode of our podcast called Housing for Huntsvillians, and I kind of talk about some of the things that I learned reading that book. So check out that episode, check out that book for more information. But I mean, essentially, oh God, where to begin? Racial residential segregation is and has been encoded into law in the US at the federal level and at the local level. And this began, depending on when you want to look at it, with the Federal Housing Authority and backing loans based on whether or not the homeowners were white or black. It had to do at the local level with zoning restrictions that weren't allowed to be explicitly racist, but were designed in such a way as to exclude Black people. And when Black people had enough money to be able to buy the homes that were in majority white areas, the racial segregation was enforced via violence in these communities. And so when I was growing up, I heard about cross burnings, and I thought that was the extent of the violence. No, Black families were lynched for daring to buy property in white neighborhoods. There was at least one instance where vigilantes burned a family alive in their home because they bought a piece of property in a white neighborhood. And so yeah, but again, the reason we have what we call exclusionary zoning, which is zoning that excludes less expensive forms of residences from certain neighborhoods, is to exclude people who are non-white and lower income from those areas to maintain the property values and the racial exclusivity of the neighborhoods that are exclusively zoned.
That you mentioned as redlining as well. I mean, one of the things I think people think about with redlining and is that it's something that's in the past. It's something that hasn't happened in a long time. But I mean, there was a ruling, what was it, last year, about major lenders still engaging in what would be considered redlining type behavior. And
if you,
yeah, go for
sorry,
it.
and if you look at the maps, the redlining maps that the real estate agents created and that corresponded with whether or not the Federal Housing Administration would back the loan, and you place those redlining maps on top of the zoning maps for most US cities, it's a perfect overlap. So they literally just replaced explicitly racist policy with implicitly racist policy.
We can see that still in our public schools. We talk about, we desegregated schools back in the 60s. But if you look at the composition of schools today, they are almost as segregated as they used to be, simply because, well, we've made different housing adjustments or different zoning laws that help perpetuate the racial makeup of neighborhoods.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And one of the other things that I think is interesting, or it's disturbing, is, and this is what I want to get to now, talk about solutions, is there are things that that happen. So this institutionalized, this is institutional racism, it's basic or systemic racism at the very minimum. These systems created the economic conditions that we're in today. So these things resonated, as I'm sure is not a surprise to you, throughout generations. Because if you were 100 years ago, your grandfather couldn't build wealth, or your grandfather was locked out of the ability to do that. That affects your father, and it affects you and your children. So one of the things that I think, one of the reasons I want to talk to you is because I feel like people in the new liberal, and just the liberal movement in general, are the few people that have solutions to these problems. And so I'm curious as to whether or not you could talk a little bit about that. What exactly do you think would go a long way to start unraveling this mess, start solving this housing living crisis, and addressing some of those systemic injustices?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the most basic level, we really don't need to have city governments telling people what they're allowed to do with their own property. Like, that just doesn't make any sense. Again, the purpose of that was racial residential segregation. The purpose of it was to protect mostly white homeowners' property values. And you can see the effects of exclusionary zoning in the racial residential segregation that we have today and in the Black-white wealth gap. So there's a huge gap between the average wealth of the average white family and the average Black family. Well, considering that housing wealth is the biggest contributor to middle-class wealth generation and savings in the US, and the fact that we systematically excluded Black and brown families from owning property and taking advantage of that housing wealth, then yeah, of course you're going to see a gap. And so getting rid of exclusionary zoning, I think, is like, there's a lot of evidence that indicates that where you either, I don't know that we've done a lot to get rid of, but where you reduce the amount of exclusionary zoning, or you legalize housing, you see average rents fall, you see average housing prices fall. So that unlocks a lot of value for individuals who want to move into different areas, particularly high opportunity areas, for those areas to have higher economic growth because more people are there, and the kinds of people who are going to be economically productive are not locked out of those areas. I don't know that they've measured the impact on the Black-white wealth gap, but it doesn't seem possible that it couldn't, help that.
Yeah.
And I think that the other solutions involve, there's kind of like solutions at the margins, and then solutions that involve just kind of rethinking how we have done things in the US. And I think that one of the things that I really want to help everyone understand is that you cannot have two things at the same time. And those two things are land value appreciation and housing wealth is the main way that people are getting wealthy in the United States, and housing is broadly affordable. Both of those things can't be happening at the same time. Housing is either a way to get rich or is broadly affordable. And the fact that we've made housing a way to get rich is profoundly stupid. It's a negative sum way to get rich. If I start a company or I invest in the stock market, someone makes a product, someone is incentivized to innovate, like, other people benefit. If I get rich off my land appreciating, I'm just taking that money from the next person who needs somewhere to live.
Yeah.
It's just a takings from one generation to the next.
Yeah.
And in the wrong direction. We're transferring money from the young and relatively poor to the old and relatively rich. And because America is getting browner, we're transferring money, and because home ownership is concentrated among white people for reasons of policy, we're transferring money from young, poor, brown people to old, rich, white people. Like, that is not a sane way to create an economic system. So I think we need to separate the idea of where you live from how you save money. Housing should be a commodity. It should be something you just pay for and consume, like transportation or food. It's a necessity. It's not a savings vehicle. It's not something that you want to make sure gets more expensive over time because someone has to pay for that.
I'm curious as to how you address that, because you'd mentioned it exactly. It's exactly true. Exclusionary zoning was set up for the purpose of, enriching a small minority at the expense of the majority. And it continues to be used that way today. That's basically the whole origin of the word NIMBYs. It's that every time somebody wants to come into a neighborhood because they see market demand, they see people that can't afford to buy or rent a property because prices are too high. The developer sees the market signal, they come in and try to build something. Then you have a bunch of rich landowners that are relying on this savings model show up and try to shut it down. So I'm curious as to whether or not you guys in the New Liberal Project, because I know you guys think about this a lot, like what is like a tactical solution to that problem? I mean, is it all in zoning? Are there any other solutions that you found that have worked well to solve that challenge?
I think mostly it is changing. So you have to change the laws. At the end of the day, if it's illegal to build, you can't build. So changing the zoning ordinances to make it legal to build forms of housing that are naturally more affordable is going to be important. And just to legalize more homes. So if you have exclusionary zoning, that generally means there are only so many units of housing you can build on a particular parcel. If you legalize more units on the same size parcel, you get more units of housing, which reduces the cost of housing. So that's kind of like necessary. In addition, you have places where it's legal to build the housing, but it's easy for property owners to get in the way of building it, even though it's legal. And so that's like a permitting issue. And so in those places, what you really need to implement is what's called like by right or ministerial permitting. So if your project meets all requirements, then you get your permit, and that, neighbors don't get a chance to come and make things more expensive and time consuming for the developer, which in turn makes each unit of housing more expensive. I think there are certain other aspects of regulation that make housing more expensive. Like, I think it was Jerusalem Demzus wrote about like staircase requirements in terms of like building code requirements that are maybe not even the safest way to do things anymore, but add to the cost of housing. There's like, I think it's called Davis-Bacon, which mandates prevailing wages if a project is more than 5 stories, I believe, which means if a developer wants to build an apartment building that's more than 5 stories, the cost of labor increased dramatically. So this is part of what's difficult, is that there are a lot of different aspects of, and that's just the regulatory aspect of what it costs to build housing. Then you've got, like, again, labor, you've got materials, we've got supply chain issues, there are tariffs, like there are all kinds of things. There's a cost of financing. It's expensive to borrow money right now. So it's complicated, but so that's kind of the policy side. There's a lot going on. There are, like, for example, in Huntsville, we have a zoning code, apparently, from what planning told me, that essentially if a kind of building is not specifically allowed in the zoning code, then it's not allowed to be built. And so I asked, hey, can we build single room occupancy, SRO buildings in Huntsville? I asked planning this, and they said no. And I said, why? Like, what part of the zoning code prohibits SROs? SROs, by the way, Nicholas Kristof, one of the worst people in the world, just published an op-ed in the New York Times praising SROs. And so I'm like, I got to give him credit. He's right about this. SROs are great. It's a naturally affordable form of housing. It's essentially, it's like a boarding house where you have residents sharing amenities such as bathrooms or kitchens. And is it the way most people would want to live? Maybe not necessarily, but it's better than a tent.
Yeah, of course.
So anyway, it's not legal to build SROs in Huntsville. Well, of course, that's going to artificially increase the cost of housing. So there's lots of regulatory issues, but then there's also, how do we get people to understand that these regulatory issues are, that they want housing, and that's where the decoupling wealth generation and housing comes in, where if people aren't thinking, okay, if I help solve this problem societally, it's going to hurt me individually, right? If we can decouple those things, then we don't have that tension. But then in addition, it's just like, it's really hard to get housing costs to actually go down in the United States. So probably your housing appreciation will just slow down if you permit a lot of housing, and there are going to be all of these benefits to society, and some of them are going to impact you positively as well. So, like, hey, and the other thing is, and this is what's been working in cities like Seattle and San Francisco is 70% renters. So 70% of people in San Francisco aren't negatively impacted when rents go down. So we have to organize the people who are individually benefited. I think we have to work with the people who might see their housing wealth not rise as quickly, and just generally kind of try to, because a lot of renters are still in, they call it car brain. I don't know. We don't really have a word for this, but like housing wealth brain, where it's like, well, I want to get on the property ladder and I want to get my foot in the door to housing wealth. And it's like, no, we need to rethink that whole concept.
John, Oh, you go for it.
My house, I couldn't afford my house. We bought it 4 or 5 years ago. I couldn't afford my house today. It's almost doubled what it was 4 or 5 years ago. And so if we wanted to move, we could sell and make a great profit. But the problem is, where then would we move to? We have to move further out of town, further away, and that would increase the cost. So that, we talk about, there's the upside of, our houses are worth more, we have more wealth. But in reality, some of the downsides to that can be pretty impactful. A lot of these policies, they have Milton Friedman said, judge a policy based on its outcome, not its intention. So many of these policies have the intention of making housing safer, making it better. But in reality, what you do is you increase the cost to where it prices people out of the market. So instead of them having any housing, it really prices so many people out of it they can't even afford it.
And something I want to add to that, Cathy, you might have seen this too. When I talk to young people, I hear of the housing crisis as an example of capitalism run amok, right? It's this idea that these rich developers are screwing over the little guy. And to some extent, you're right. They use the zoning rules to try to effectively, manipulate the market to enrich themselves. But one of the things that I think, people of our kind of political persuasion need to do a good job of is showing the distinction between this restrictionary government mandated control over the market, and then actually the value of what happens when you actually have a free market capitalist system. It creates a commodification of housing. It drives down prices and allows everyone to kind of get onto that economic ladder if we truly embrace the principles that we embrace in other industries, right? And so I think Brian Kaplan was an economist who said, the housing market is not really operating like a capitalist free market system. It's this weird pseudo mix of government mandates and there's no real competition. But one of the things I was going to ask was tying it back to homelessness. If you guys are comfortable with making a pivot back to that, because homelessness is a massive problem in every city in the United States. San Francisco is probably one of the worst, but I mean, it's a problem everywhere you go. Have you had any, personal experiences or encounters that have shaped your understanding of homelessness and how it relates back to this housing crisis? I know that you had just put out an entire episode right before we spoke about this problem specifically as it relates to Huntsville, but I'm curious as to how you see that challenge and how the conversations we're having about market forces could help solve the homelessness crisis as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to talk about that. Before I do, though, I want to go back to the capitalism argument.
Yeah, sure.
Because it's very frustrating when I hear people posit solutions like, I think we should limit or ban people who are out of state or who live outside the country from buying houses, or we should ban multinational corporations or companies from buying houses, or we should, kill all landlords, or, yada, yada. And it's like, what would stop these people from investing in single family homes if we made them a bad investment? And you know how we do that? We build a lot more housing.
Yep.
If you build a lot more housing, each unit of housing is less profitable. And so you remove the incentive. The best way to disempower a landlord is to build another apartment complex.
Yep.
Right?
That's
Landlords
right.
should be competing for tenants, not the other way around. And the fact that tenants are competing for landlords is why landlords have so much power.
Well, and on top of that too, Cathy, I feel like if you're removing the crazy permitting restrictions and all the connections and the political clout that you need to get a development approved, then you also create the ability for people to have economic mobility, because you have any developer can build, right? You don't have to be friends with the mayor's son to get your permit approved. Yes. And that solves a problem there too. I'm sorry to derail you. I just thought that was worthwhile to mention.
No, for sure. Anyway, enough about that.
Yeah.
But going back to homelessness, I mean, my parents divorced when I was 7 years old, I want to say. And we immediately went we lived in a large single family home in the suburbs of Madison to outside the city, a little bit outside the city, a nice large home to a It was 3 of us, and it was a 2-bedroom, and it was surrounded by trailers on 3 sides, because that's what my mom could afford, right? And we came home from church one day, and our front door was open, ajar, and we had been burglarized. And so then we got burglar bars on our windows, but there was only one door in the whole place, and it was like a shotgun house. So if there had been a fire, we would have just burned to death. Like, it was not safe in any way, shape, or form. And like, yeah, so from a very young age, housing scarcity has been an issue in my life. And this is not a particularly expensive part of the country at a time when housing was particularly expensive. But if you're not making a lot of money, that's your situation. And when I was right out of college, my mom lost her housing, so she had to double up for a while. So I've experienced housing insecurity and homelessness in my immediate family, and I have personally stayed in housing situations that were, not entirely safe because of housing scarcity and the cost of housing. I've been in a lot of weird, I shared a living room with someone for a while, with a roommate in San Francisco. I lived in another living room with like 3 other people in San Francisco one time, because the rent is too damn high, and I've never made all that much money. And so when I first moved to San Francisco, I had really nice, stable housing. I lived in Noe Valley, and I had lived in Huntsville, Birmingham, and Washington, D.C. at that point. So I had seen a little bit of homelessness, but I'd never really experienced severe homelessness. So I'm walking from my home in Noe Valley, which is a very nice part of San Francisco, to Market Street, which is not a very nice part of San Francisco. And I saw a guy splayed out on the sidewalk, seemingly unconscious, bleeding from the head. So I called 911. I'm like, this person needs immediate medical attention. And I was going to be late, so I made the call, reported what was happening, and kept walking. And by the time I got to my meeting, I realized if I called 911 every time I saw someone who needed help immediately, I would never get anywhere. Like, it was just overwhelming. And it became part of the backdrop of life to just see people who desperately needed help. And I realized everywhere I lived, I was like, when I'm walking in Huntsville, I've had at least 2 or 3 times people will stop their cars and be like, do you need help? Because they are not used to seeing people walk. But I realized in San Francisco, if I ever needed help, I wouldn't get any, because people are inured to people who desperately need help all the time. And that was a very frightening realization. And it's dehumanizing for everyone involved to see that level of need and suffering and literally just not be able to do anything about it on an individual level. So that got me radicalized to a greater extent about, all right, what causes homelessness and what do we do about it? And why are we tolerating it as a society? And what is it doing to us to tolerate it? And coming back to Huntsville and seeing that our rates of homelessness were on the rise for the same reasons, I was just like, I don't see anything higher ROI to work on right now.
When a lot of people look at this and say, "Oh, well, we just need government to build housing, or we just need government to come in and put everybody on a stipend to cover these rising housing costs." What do you say to them?
Well, that again, housing can't be a wealth generation vehicle and broadly affordable at the same time. There's a reason Vienna built 60% of their housing stock is government built, because housing isn't a wealth generation vehicle for the 40% who are using market rate housing. Every unit of housing the government builds reduces the value of the rest of the housing stock, reduces the price of it, and every unit of housing costs what it costs to build a market rate unit, which is artificially expensive, plus more. So subsidized housing is more expensive to build than market rate housing, mostly due to financing issues. So we literally can't afford to build as much housing as we need to build at the rate it costs to build housing, because we've made it artificially expensive so it can be a wealth generation vehicle.
My goodness. And unraveling that, it's like a chicken or egg problem all the way down. And one of the questions I was going to ask you was like, so I think there's a misconception with people about homelessness and what causes people to become homeless.
Absolutely.
So a lot of people, I think, I don't know about you, but I mean, I also grew up in the conservative Bible Belt South. And, you know, I think the perception among most of my peers when I was younger was, oh, you know, you're homeless because you failed in life in some way. You're an addict. You did something wrong. You missed the boat. Can you talk to a bit about the relationship between homelessness, poverty, homelessness, and mental illness? And what do you think the primary driver of homelessness is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm trying to figure out a way to explain this in a way that's clear. And I have not figured it out yet. But the best way I can articulate it without you having to read Homelessness is a Housing Problem, which is an excellent book, and I highly recommend Homelessness is a Housing Problem. But there's a difference between causes of homelessness at the individual level and causes of homelessness at the systemic level. So if I look at any individual person who's experienced homelessness, I can identify quote unquote reasons that they're experiencing homelessness in terms of what are things that tend to be more true of individuals who experience homelessness versus the general population. And these include mental illness, addiction, being male, being queer, yada, yada, having a disability. These are things that are generally more true of people who experience homelessness than the general population. But these are not the causes of homelessness as a phenomenon. Mental illness does not cause homelessness. And we know this because when we look at different cities and different states, they have different levels of homelessness. So they have rates of homelessness. How common is homelessness in the population? And there's no connection between poverty, mental illness, addiction, disability. None of these individual factors, queerness, being male, none of these individual factors correlate with rates of homelessness. In fact, joblessness and poverty have an inverse correlation. So where we see more poverty, we see lower rates of homelessness. Where we see more unemployment, we see more rates of, places that have high employment have high homelessness, which is the opposite of how it works on an individual level. So what causes homelessness at the individual level is not what causes homelessness at the systemic level. The analogy that they use in housing is homelessness is the housing problem is musical chairs. So if you're playing musical chairs and one of you can't walk, that person is probably less likely to win the game. But what causes them to lose isn't that they can't walk, it's that the chair was taken away, right? And in this analogy, the chair is housing. The thing that causes homelessness is a lack of housing, is not having a home. The person who has the individual factor, all else equal, if there aren't enough homes and we're all competing for homes, the person who has more advantages in life is going to be more likely to get and keep the home. But that doesn't mean that caused the other person to lose the home. What caused the other person to lose the home was that there weren't two homes and there were two people who needed them.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, it does. It's an interesting way of looking at it, and that's definitely not the way a lot of people look at it. Let's put it that way. And I think it's important to make a mindset shift when you think about the problem that way. That's very powerful. So with that in mind, do you foresee the way, I mean, again, we tie it back to what we just talked about. The real solution to the homelessness problem is the same solution to the housing crisis. It's reducing the cost of homes, and it's creating more, following market forces. Do you have any thoughts on whether there are additional policies or solutions that could also, add more punch to trying to solve that problem in any way?
This is one of those questions where I'm gonna log off and then be like, so many things I wish I'd said. I mean, I think at the end of the day, reducing land use restrictions is just necessary. Like, again, I don't think it makes sense on a efficiency or fairness level to dictate what other people can do with their property.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have this idea that restrictive zoning and land use regulations are to prevent noxious uses. So, if I don't regulate how land is used, then they're going to put a chemical plant next to my single family home, and
Right.
I'm going to have to breathe in pollution. We're not building a lot of factories in the United States. Like, we're not doing a lot of noxious uses anymore. Like, the worst that's going to happen is like there's a WeWork next to you,
Or an Amazon fulfillment center.
Bad in its own right, but that's a whole different.
Right. Noxious like narcissism, but
Exactly.
Otherwise, I think it's fine.
You mentioned development by right earlier on, and for those who don't know, development by right is you're allowed to develop, and if someone thinks that you shouldn't be allowed to develop in a certain way, they have to prove why you shouldn't be allowed to develop a property. And I think that's a perfectly acceptable middle ground, because yes, there are some things that shouldn't be built right next to an elementary school, right? Whether it's a chemical factory or it's a nudist bar, or whatever it is. There are some things that, okay, we should keep some things separate. That's okay. There's a lot of talk, in the YIMBY world, we hear about cities that are, removing their parking minimums. They're allowing pre-approved house plans. Where in the U.S. have we really seen a lot of these policies come into play and made a real world impact?
That is a great question, and I'm going to pull up my notes. I know in Seattle, we've seen a lot of building supply, and that has actually created falling rents in some years. If you look at just there are people who will deny that there's a connection between they'll admit there's a connection between supply, demand, and prices for other things, but they think that housing is somehow magically exempt from these phenomena. But if you look at pandemic, for example, you saw a mass exodus from cities like New York, and when you saw the demand for housing in that city decrease and the stock of housing, the supply of housing stay the same, prices dipped, because as it turns out, housing is not immune from the impact of supply and demand. Let me look at other examples. Berkeley.
It's always funny, I think a lot of people try to separate on certain pet issues that they have. They say, well, market forces are somehow different in my particular area. Well, they're different. They, supply and demand don't have the same impact, when in reality, market forces are market forces pretty much in any market.
Yep.
Sure, I can understand
there are industries where you don't want to follow market forces, like prisons, for example.
Justice
we don't want to make it cheap and efficient to
military, for example. Rights, sorry, I do not want private militaries. Sorry, yeah. It's just me.
Yeah.
And there are things where demand elasticity is not as much, right? So like if you need a medical procedure, you pretty much need that medical procedure. But housing is not, as it turns out, an inelastic. Yes, we all need a place to live, but there's a lot of room in that decision for where to live and in what kind of housing you can live. And so in that way, supply and demand will impact pricing. Mumbai has just seen zoning deregulation, and they found that not only did pricing go down in Mumbai, but Average home buyer incomes are up or down 3.18% post deregulation. Sao Paulo reduced their floor area, BAR requirements, and they saw average housing prices decline and supply increase after their zoning changes in Sao Paulo. DC actually had a really interesting natural experiment where they compared, I want to say, Georgetown with Navy Yard. And so I don't know if it was Georgetown, but some neighborhood in DC didn't see a zoning change, but Navy Yard did implement a zoning change, and Navy Yard saw an increase of supply in housing and a decrease in average rents in Navy Yard. And so that's an example. I thought, now that inflation is such a part of the conversation, it was really interesting that in Minneapolis, there was a rezoning and it led to an increase in supply, and Minneapolis saw rents increase at like 1%, like a much slower increase than comparable cities as a result of that supply. And Minneapolis had the lowest rate of inflation in the United States post upzoning. And so you see a lot of benefits. And I think, obviously, like we talked about some of the benefits to upzoning. One of them is, so there's a lot of talk right now about like a vibe session, where when you look at the actual numbers for how the economy is doing, it's doing like really well. We're at like record employment, and wages are up, and any kind of really economic indicator you'd want to look at is doing pretty well, but people are feeling very negative about the economy. So like, what's the cause? And I was listening to the Journal podcast this morning, which I love, which I'm like, I don't know how I feel about the fact that I love it, but I do. And they were talking to Janet Yellen, and Janet Yellen, they were like, what's with the vibes? And she said, it's housing prices. Like, people feel like inflation is out of control because they're paying so much for housing, which is not a Fed thing. It's not even a national policy thing. It's certainly not a Biden thing. It's a local zoning thing.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And so it's like, if you want to like not have Trump win, upzone, right? Because people are experiencing these high housing prices, blaming Biden, and we're going to get Trump out of it because you want to protect your property values.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about.
It's wild how interconnected these things are. One of the things I see this young YIMBY movement out there. They're very active on social media. They're very active in their communities, calling on city councils to change laws. But what I don't see Republicans or Democrats really broadly taking on these YIMBY policies. It's not like they're not changing their platform to say, yes, let's have development by right. You'll find a politician on both sides here and there, but by and large, why hasn't, there's been a very young, very loud movement. Why haven't we really seen that, or have we seen that filter down into the political parties and have them adopt these policies? Is it because young people are not really respected in the political movement? Like we look at the money is where, money
might be 5 years behind.
Right. It might be 5 years behind, where the money just isn't there yet. The younger people don't have the money to influence the policies. I don't want to be that too Debbie Downer about it, but there might be something there. It just seems strange to me that you have such a loud and passionate movement of really and very active activists, but we haven't seen it filter into the political party scene.
Well, I think the two things that are interesting I think it's a really good question. I think it's like one of the questions we need to answer. And I think one of the things is everything is so national and really outsized to what it matters. Like the things that matter, the policies that matter, the politics that matter to any individual on any given day about any topic are disproportionately local. Who the president is really has very little impact on your day-to-day. But because of the media ecosystem and the policy and the economic incentives of the political parties, all of the attention is on national. And land use is not a national issue for the most part. Land use is not regulated at the national level for the most part. It's regulated at the local level, and not even at the state level. It's like the city level. And how much do you hear about anything that has to do with city politics? Like, it's just not talked about by the
Also,
parties.
zoning is one of the most not sexy issues it's so boring.
Yeah, it's so boring. And I think an extra problem with this is that zoning and land use are talked about in big cities, A, because they're more salient there and they've been more salient for a longer time, and B, because it's more of an issue on the Democratic side than the Republican side for various reasons right now. But in most of the country, the rural areas are Republican and they're just starting to wake up to the fact that we're even in a housing crisis. So I think that's part of the problem. And then I think the third problem is that, and these are solidly Republican, like Democrats have no salience to these areas whatsoever. And then I think the third thing is that politics, especially local politics, is dominated by old, rich white people who are predominantly homeowners. So they are not motivated to see any kind of changes that would solve these societal problems because they wouldn't benefit them individually. So when you look at who votes, who gives to candidates, who writes their representatives, like older, richer, whiter people are vastly overrepresented. So I think those three factors have a lot to do with it. But I also think that these are problems that are changing. I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that local politics is far more impactful in their daily lives, and they can have much more of an impact on local politics. I think people are starting to realize that they have aligned priorities with other people who are younger and renters and less white. But as far as the polarization, yeah, that just seems to be getting worse.
Well, I hope that changes in the next couple of years, and it is sad because inherently the systems that enrich these people at the top, the ownership of property and the fact that it's so hard to get property if you don't already have it, is part of the reason why there's such an economic incentive to keep the status quo protected, because they've got all this money it's on stake. So it's going to be a fun fight. So, we're about at an hour, so I wanted to ramp us down, but I will say, what is your outlook on this broadly in the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, do you see momentum? I mean, even if it's just in your community on this issue. I mean, I could say anecdotally that I see real momentum on the YIMBY movement, but I'm curious as to whether or not you have any perspective you want to share in your outlook. Like, do you see us making progress in 5 to 10 years? Are you optimistic?
I'm very optimistic. I think exclusionary zoning and using land value appreciation as a wealth generation vehicle is a thing that has corrupted American politics and exacerbated racial disparities in terms of health, education, wealth generation, economic opportunity. I think it's exacerbated income inequality. I think it's exacerbated the fact that geographic mobility is down, that economic mobility is down. So the chances that your kid is going to be, significantly wealthy or less wealthy than you, that's down over decades. And I think our land use policies have vastly contributed to all of those ills. And there are more people in the US, and more every day, who are getting screwed by exclusionary zoning than are benefiting from it. And like, it's a societal ill whose time I think is coming to be reevaluated. And it just, I don't think the numbers make sense for it to continue. And I think that the people who benefit from it are going to defend it with everything they have, but demographics are not on their side, and the truth is not on their side, and justice is not on their side. And so it will be defeated, and I hope it's quickly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing that I think we kind of, you know, one aspect of this, you know, they don't quite think about it being related, but it really is one of the best ways to get people to not be racist, to not hate, you know, people that aren't like them, is to get them to interact with people who aren't like them. And so we have this system of policies from local governments that says, no, we have to keep everyone apart. Imagine if we, instead of 70 whatever years it is since, you know, the civil rights era, 70 years of that, if we had, instead of continually dividing people up, had we not had those policies, how much better off we would have been, how we could have solved, you know, this filters down to policing, this filters up all the way back up to basically every policy, you know, written over the past 70 years can be, you know, focused back and looked at this and go, okay, our government has been manipulating our society for the worse in a lot of ways. And it's not directly, you know, we don't have the open segregation anymore. We absolutely have this hidden segregation built into these systems.
Yep.
And we clearly are quite a bit worse off for it. So I really hope that as America becomes more brown, that we start taking a look at these things and go, okay, we've got a lot of things to fix here.
Yeah. And just to add to that, centralized control in almost every case leads to these oppressive things, these unintended consequences, sometimes intended consequences. Whereas I look at market forces as truly a tool of progress, and it's a tool that can be used to solve systemic injustices. And I wish more young people could understand that. So I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking about that, because I think that's something we aren't talking about enough as a society. And if we did, we would be much farther along. But we are at an hour. So I am curious, Cathy, do you have anything you want to plug? Anything you want to tell our audience to go check out?
Yeah, definitely. I would love everyone to listen to the Housing for Huntsvillians podcast. We're on Spotify, Google, Apple, all the podcast platforms. We're also on YouTube if you want to watch us talk. And yeah, I would just love, you know, feedback on that podcast. What do you like? What do you not like? I know it's focused on Huntsville, but I honestly think Huntsville is like super representative of a lot of the United States in a way that the housing conversation that has to do with like Seattle and San Francisco is just way less applicable to the rest of the country. So check that out. I have a newsletter called Sex in the State. It goes out most weekdays, and it's just kind of my like personal essays, memoir, diary / that I also distribute the podcast that way. And then I also have another podcast called RNC Watch TV. So if you just go to cathyreisenwitz.substack.com, you can check out all of that. And yeah, I'm on those socials at Cathy Reisenwitz. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was so wonderful to get to talk about housing and anti-racism and neoliberal policy.
Yes, no, it was a pleasure. I really, really do appreciate it. For our audience, if you want to learn more about what we're doing at Project Liberal, you can go to projectliberal.org. Right now, we're in the middle of launching Operation Phoenix, and the goal of this project is we've started a hybrid PAC with the sole purpose of raising money to try to find a home for liberals, a political home for them, in order to pursue electing candidates and many of the policies that we spoke about on this call with Cathy. But again, thank you, John. Thank you, Cathy. We'll see you guys in the next episode.